Today, we're tackling a massive topic: India. Specifically, what happened when the industrial might of the British Empire collided head-on with one of the most ancient and deeply rooted societies on Earth.
You know, it's that classic riddle, right? And it's the perfect way to think about this story. The unstoppable force was, of course, the British Empire, rolling in with totally new economic and political systems. The immovable object was traditional Indian society, a structure that had, weathered centuries of change already. So what made that traditional structure so, well, immovable?
For centuries, life in India had this really interesting split personality. On the surface, you had all this drama, constant invasions, wars between dynasties, major religious shifts. Think of these like violent storms just passing overhead. But underneath all that chaos, the actual foundation of society, the self-sufficient village, it just kept on ticking, largely untouched.
To really grasp the scale of the change that was coming, we first have to understand what made this foundation so incredibly stable for so long. This old system was built on a completely different idea of how an economy should work. First off, land wasn't something you bought or sold. It belonged to the community. Agriculture and local crafts like weaving or pottery were totally intertwined. And when it came to taxes, the government dealt with the village as a whole, not individual farmers. And maybe most importantly, people produced stuff for the village to use, not for some far-off abstract market.
The sociologist A.R. Desai put it perfectly. He said this structure basically triumphantly survived everything thrown at it. I mean, think about it. It didn't matter who was sitting on the throne in some distant capital city. The day-to-day economic and social life of the village just carried on, almost completely walled off from those political storms.
But then came the British. And this was not just another political storm. No, this was something totally, fundamentally different.
And this is the critical difference. See, previous invaders had changed the rulers, sure, but they never really changed the way things were made. They worked within the existing system. The British, on the other hand, brought a brand new capitalist system with them. They didn't just pass over the foundation, they shattered it. So this wasn't another storm, it was a socio-economic earthquake that shook the very bedrock of society.
So let's look at how this earthquake actually unfolded. It started in 1793 with the permanent settlement, which, for the first time, turned community land into private, sellable property. Then, throughout the 1800s, new tech, like railways, wasn't built for India's benefit, but to get raw materials out and move British troops in. They introduced Western education, but the main goal was to create a class of local clerks and administrators to help run the colonial government. And all the while, cheap, factory-made British goods flooded the market, basically wiping out the livelihoods of local artisans.
A huge part of this was something called the commercialization of agriculture. All of a sudden, farming wasn't about growing food to feed your family and your village. It was about growing cash crops, things like indigo and cotton, that would be shipped halfway around the world to feed British factories. This tied the Indian farmer to the wild swings of a global market that they had absolutely no control over.
The social fallout from this was immense. This new system created totally new social classes that hadn't really existed before. Absentee landlords who owned the land but didn't work it, and a huge new population of landless farm workers. Artisans lost their jobs and fell into poverty. But at the very same time, a new, Western-educated Indian middle class began to emerge. And this group, well, they would play a massive role in what happened next.
So with the old society completely shattered, Indians began to ask a really profound question. What comes next? How in the world do we rebuild? And out of that question, two major schools of thought really took shape. On one side, you had the social reformers. They argued that India needed to modernize, to adopt Western ideas about liberalism and science, and to get rid of traditions they saw as harmful. But on the other hand, you had the social revivalists. They believed the answer was to go back to the roots, to rediscover and purify the original core ideas of ancient Indian thought.
A key figure on the reformist side was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He started a movement called the Brahmo Samaj, and his idea was to create a kind of synthesis, a modern path that blended the ethical teachings of Christianity with the deep philosophy of the Vedanta, while getting rid of things like idol worship and the rigid caste system.
And then representing the revivalist path, you had Swami Dayanand Saraswati. His movement, the Arya Samaj, had a powerful call: go back to the Vedas. The idea was to strip away centuries of superstition and ritual and get back to what he saw as the pure, original message of these ancient texts. It was a powerful way of reasserting Indian identity from within.
Now, what's so important to understand is that these intense debates about religion and society, they weren't just philosophical exercises. These conversations were the very thing that forged a new political consciousness, a new idea of what it even meant to be Indian in this new, modern world.
And you can literally see how that new consciousness flowed directly into politics. Look at the steps here. First, you have the social and religious debates which laid all the intellectual groundwork. That led to the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885, giving these ideas a political home. That, in turn, grew into the huge mass movements led by people like Gandhi, which ultimately led to independence in 1947 and a modern constitution in 1950. The social awakening led directly to the political one.
But to really get a handle on this new India, we have to look at two social frameworks that were there before, during, and after this whole process, shaping everything: caste and class.
The difference here is absolutely fundamental. Caste is a closed system. You are born into it, it's hereditary, and it's backed by religious tradition. Class, on the other hand, is much more open. It's based on things like your wealth, your job, your education, and you can move up or down. One is a religious hierarchy, the other is an economic one.
And this is where that colonial earthquake really scrambled things up. In pre-British India, your caste and your economic class were usually pretty much the same thing. A high caste almost always meant you had a high economic status. But colonialism blew that connection apart, creating what sociologists call dissonant categories. All of a sudden, you could be from a high caste but be completely broke, or you could be from a lower caste but find a way to get wealthy in the new economy. All the old certainties were just gone.
And what's really fascinating is how these ideas of hierarchy proved to be incredibly sticky. They even adapted themselves inside religions that, on paper, preach total equality. So among Indian Muslims, you have a distinction between the Ashraf, who claim to be descended from immigrants, and local converts. Among Christians, the Syrian Christians in Kerala hold a very high status, tracing their ancestry back to Brahmin converts. These social lines have proven to be incredibly persistent.
So that brings us finally to the India of today, a nation that is constantly, every single day, trying to figure out this complex legacy of change and continuity. And a lot of the country's most urgent modern challenges are deeply tangled up in this history. Things like widespread poverty, explosive population growth, and all the pressures that come with rapid urbanization, like the growth of slums, rising unemployment, and crime. These are all part of the complex inheritance of the last couple of centuries.
Which brings us right back to the central paradox of modern India. I mean, the country has transformed in ways that are just unbelievable. It has a modern constitution, a super dynamic economy, a major presence on the world stage, and yet, those deep roots of tradition, the importance of caste, of family, of community, they're still profoundly influential, shaping everything from who you marry to how you vote.
And that leaves us with a final, really fundamental question. For India, and really for any society going through huge changes, the challenge is constant. How do you balance the powerful pull of a deep, complicated history with the urgent need to build a new and different future? It's a conversation that's still very much happening today.